Olá, tudo bem? Eu sou Luciano Pádua, sou editor de macroeconomia aqui da revista Exame e hoje eu venho apresentar para vocês um formato um pouco diferente de um programa que você já conhece. Aqui na Exame a gente tem o Macro em Pauta, nosso programa de entrevistas com autoridades, membros do primeiro, segundo escalão, CEOs, que falam sobre os temas que tocam a macroeconomia, né, como política, economia, política pública, decisões de governo e de empresas. Hoje, eu e o Rafael Balago, nosso repórter de mundo aqui da Exame, tivemos a oportunidade de conversar com uma pessoa muito especial. A gente falou com o professor de Economia e Desenvolvimento Econômico de Harvard, o professor Ricardo Hausmann. Ricardo Hausmann é venezuelano, ele tem uma trajetória muito forte na acadêmica dentro da economia, ele elaborou teorias sobre complexidade econômica e há muitos anos ele é professor de Harvard e também é responsável pelo Growth Lab, onde é um centro da universidade que ele visita países e faz recomendações, então ele acaba conhecendo muito da economia global. Nessa entrevista, a gente falou sobre o governo Trump e as tarifas que ele está aplicando e como isso pode afetar a economia global e os países emergentes. Falamos sobre financiamento climático, falamos sobre Venezuela, falamos sobre por que o Brasil não aumenta a sua capacidade de inovação. Enfim, tem muitos temas interessantes e é muito legal poder ter a visão de uma pessoa que está olhando para todo o globo. Então, é isso. Fica com a gente, assiste esse programa que eu acho que você vai gostar muito.
Professor, thank you so much for talking with us today. I start asking you about the Trump administration because Trump is every day threatening to create new tariffs, probably will lead to a trade war between countries. And I want to hear your opinion about how these tariffs, if implemented, could affect the growth of countries, especially in emerging countries such as Brazil.
So I think that the fundamental characteristic of the Trump administration is its unpredictability. It's not that the tariffs are going to go up or tariffs are going to go down. We just don't know. One day he announces tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and then the next day he takes them away. He announces tariffs on the EU. It's obvious that he has some desire to impose those tariffs, but then when the stock market takes a dive, he gets scared and takes them back. So it's not obvious to me that we know what is going to happen with trade policy in the US. But we know for sure that trade policy with the US has become much more uncertain. And companies are going to be responding to the fact that trade policy is so unpredictable that you just don't know what's going to happen. And I think that by itself is going to have an impact on trade, but also on investment decisions, which is a little bit what Trump is after. The idea was, the ideas of free trade agreements like, say, the NAFTA that then was substituted by the USMCA, or any of the other trade agreements that countries sign, is that it gives the private sector predictability over what's going to be the future of the trading conditions. And many of the academic studies suggest that it is this predictability of the future that causes the benefits or the impact of these trade agreements. So by threatening tariffs on Mexico and Canada, even though those two countries have a treaty with the US on it, indicates that the treaty that they've signed that got a 2/3 majority in the Senate and so on, you think it's a source of stability, that treaty is not worth the paper it's written on. Because through presidential decision and executive order, you can just increase tariffs by 25%, end of story. So I think that the world under Trump is going to be dominated by the consequences of the unpredictability of US behavior. And that's going to lead to many consequences.
One thing that I would like to ask, also adding up to that, is in your theory of economic complexity, product space has a very important position regarding economies, right? How do you position your products and the number of letters that your economy has, and more letters you have, more complexity you have in your economy. But how these trade wars can affect the whole complexity of the economy in the world? I mean, like, for example, let's take the example of Mexico and the US. A lot of products, they come in and they go out and they go back to the US and they go to Mexico. This is how the complexity takes place. So, taking for your theory, how does this trade war that Trump's trying to impose is gonna affect the economic complexity in the world in a more broader sense?
I think that Trump is not going to act on this trade policy that he has announced, because I think he's going to very quickly learn that the effects are devastating. And the reason is, as you just mentioned in your question, that countries no longer are able to make a product. That a product is made by a whole combination of countries, whether it's because you're assembling an iPhone or a Galaxy phone. Its parts are coming from many, many different places. The US no longer knows how to make the semiconductors that go into it. There's the screen, there's the different components of it, and it's just something that gets sourced very globally. The US cannot make a phone. The US cannot make an airplane. These products require the combination of the output of many, many firms. A car has over 50,000 parts. An airplane has several million parts. These parts are coming from all over the place. If you're going to put not only tariffs, but 25% tariffs on these value chains, they will implode. And it will have such devastating effects, because these things currently cross borders many times in the production process. And if every time it's 25%, you see that's going to build up to something crazy. So I don't think that these policies will stick. I fear that these policies will be imposed, they'll realize the devastating effect, and they will be reversed, and they'll find an excuse to reverse them. That's why I say that what I'm expecting is an enormous amount of uncertainty and noise associated with this unpredictability of US policy. But I don't think that it's a policy that's going to stick, because I think it's so national interest of the US that there'll be just too much of an uproar for the policy to stick.
Perfect. Rafael?
Professor, I want to talk about Venezuela now. Is it possible to say that the situation is getting better in the country compared to the last decades? In which ways do you see to Venezuela to go back to become more like a normal economy?
Well, Venezuela is a minuscule fraction of what it used to be. GDP has fallen by about 75%. So that means that the economy 12 years ago, 13 years ago, used to be 4 times bigger than it is now. So that economic collapse has not reversed. We are still 1/4 of where we used. 8 million people have left the country. The net flow of migration is still out of the country, in spite of the fact that things in the country of destination, whether it's Colombia, that has like 2.5 million Venezuelans, or Chile that has 700,000 Venezuelans, Brazil that's having an increasing number of Venezuelans, or Spain, or the situation there has not been buoyant. And in spite of that, the net flows are still positive. People are leaving the country. So that's the first indication that Venezuelans don't think that the situation has improved significantly. It is true that inflation has come down. We had a bout of hyperinflation. It peaked at around 2.2 million%. Now we don't have that because the government has effectively been able to lower government spending by paying government employees $5 or $10 a month, by reducing the minimum pension to $3 a month. So essentially, by defaulting on pensioners, by making it impossible for public employees to live on a public wage, they have decimated the universities. The universities are paying $10 a month to a professor. They cannot keep them, so that's why they've decimated the universities. And in addition, because they massively lost the election of July 28th, they have had to respond. They stole the election and dramatically increased repression. So there's now something, more than 2,000 people have been put in jail since those elections. There are now people have been condemned to 15 years of prison for having tweeted, for having issued a tweet. So it's not only that the economic situation is a disaster, the freedom situation is a disaster. So it is completely unexplainable how the Department of Homeland Security reversed the extension of the temporary protection status to 700,000 Venezuelans on the ground that the situation in the country had improved. This is really unbelievable, unacceptable.
You think talking about immigration, do you think current immigration policies, there is a goal to deport something like 1 million people by this year or next year? Do you think it will have an effect on the American economy as well?
Definitely. I mean, the reason why there was a boom in immigration is that the US labor market was super hot. So the US went through a period in which there were more than 2 vacancies for every unemployed person. So that means that there's excess demand for labor. And when people realized that the US labor market was super hot, everybody tried to get in. And that's why the US got a boom in immigration, and they got an acceleration of growth. So if now you're telling me not only are you scaring everybody not to go into the US, but in addition, you are kicking people out, that means that there will be a dramatic change in the speed at which labor supply grows. And with less labor supply, there's going to be a reduction in growth, and there's going to be an acceleration of inflation. So I think that that's what we're observing right now, that we're observing the economy slowing down, and we're observing inflation going up. That's the same effect of the tariffs. Tariffs are going to have the similar effect. They're going to constrain companies from accessing inputs, and it's going to make production more difficult. So growth goes down and inflation accelerates. So I think that's what we're observing right now. I think we're at the beginning of that process, but that's where these policies are leading.
And there is a broader issue that relates with this inflationary risk, which is fiscal challenges. Even in the US, the GDP debt growth, the debt GDP rate has been growing fastly rapidly in the past years, and Trump has a plan. Mr. Trump has a plan to change that. But I would like to ask you also, this is a very important topic in Brazil, Germany, Argentina, also Venezuela. So, how do you see, how can governments balance, increasing spending to stimulate growth and also having some fiscal austerity or some fiscal sanity in their country?
I mean, every country is a bit different. I would say the US is clearly running an unsustainable fiscal policy. Typically, you would expect to see large deficits in the context of some kind of crisis. You would expect to see large deficit in the because in a recession, your tax revenues go down, unemployment compensation goes up. So, in a recession, you typically see bad fiscal outcomes or bigger deficits. But you would expect that as the economy grows in a boom phase and GDP is growing a lot, then tax revenues a lot, unemployment is very low, so unemployment compensation is not that important, and as a consequence, the fiscal deficit it narrows naturally. What's weird about the US is that the US is having record fiscal deficit boom. It's sort of like at the end of the boom. This is at the time when you would expect very, very small deficits or even surpluses, but they're running deficits to the tune of something like 7% of GDP. So the US is clearly in an unsustainable path. But the Trump administration has announced its intention to significantly lower tax revenues. And in the budget the budget parameters that they approved a few days ago, they announced cuts in taxes to the tune of something like $4 trillion and cuts in spending to the tune of something like $2 trillion. So they announced an increase in the fiscal deficit by $2 trillion over the next decade, which means that in some sense they're moving in the wrong direction. They inherited an unsustainable fiscal deficit and they're increasing it. I haven't heard of a strategy to lower the deficit because they're still very committed to the reduction of taxes. And they want to reduce corporate income taxes, personal income taxes at the top, and they have that in their agenda, but they don't have the strategy to cut spending to pay for those tax cuts. So the U.S. is probably going to remain in the next few years in still an unsustainable fiscal policy, but they don't pay the cost that other countries pay in terms of losing the trust of markets in terms of accessing finance. So, for example, because the markets have become more pessimistic about US growth, which in itself would be bad for the fiscal deficit, the interest rate on US government bonds has been coming down because bad growth means they expect the central bank to lower interest rates, and that's why interest rates are coming down. In Brazil, you get the opposite effect, that when the market thinks that the fiscal policy is unsustainable, interest rates go up. And the fact that interest rates go up puts you in this very dangerous dynamic that we saw the last time when Mantega was the finance minister and Dilma was the president, where bad news on the economy lead to bad news on the deficit, leads to higher interest rates, which generates bad news on the economy and a worsening fiscal deficit. That vicious circle is something that people have been concerned over the last few months to happen in Brazil. The case of Germany is different because in Germany, the debt levels are very low. The fiscal policy is very conservative. And what they have is that they interpret that the US government is withdrawing its security guarantees, it's withdrawing its defense umbrella, and as a consequence, they need to be able to fund a very rapid acceleration of their defense expenditures. And their current fiscal rules don't allow them to do that. So they're trying to find to make their fiscal rules more flexible so that they can increase the fiscal deficit and in order to fund a defense expansion. So that's my summary of these three, I would think, rather different cases.
So, but taking a deep dive into Brazil or a dive into Brazil, it's been a while since the Growth Lab and the Center for International Development hasn't done a full scale kind of like paper on Brazil. But I was wondering, what is your assessment of our economy? And there's a lot of criticism here in Brazil that we have been gambling on industrial policy. We have been betting on uh, state intervention, but not in a very efficient way. Of course, this criticism is from the markets, which have a different ideology from the current government. But I would like to understand you. What is your assessment of the Brazilian economy, and what is the path for a country like Brazil to economic development?
Well, I mean, what has happened to Brazil over the last, say, 20 years or so is that the country has become more focused on primary products. It has become a superpower in agriculture. It has become a superpower in minerals. And it has become a very minor player in manufacturing. And I think that that decline in its role as a manufacturing entity is a little bit related to very limited innovation in the economy. We do have some innovation elements in the economy. I think there's been a technological revolution in agriculture. There has been, interesting things like Nubank in finance, where fintechs have been doing well, but we have not seen Brazil being able to in more high technology complex activity. The way that we have seen Korea participate or Taiwan participate or others participate. I remember writing a paper in 1980 with a colleague of mine, a Chilean colleague of mine. That's been a while ago. No, that's 45 years ago. Where we talked about the NICs in those days, which were the newly industrializing countries. And the paper talked about these four countries: Brazil, Mexico, Korea, and Taiwan. In those days, Brazil was richer than Korea and Taiwan in income per capita and was more advanced. And now it looks incredibly far behind in income per capita, in innovation, etc. So Brazil has to ask itself, why was it not able to undergo the kind of technological transformation, the kind of productive transformation that happened in East Asia? In those days, we were thinking that, yeah, that's not a problem because East Asia is focused on garments and it's because they have cheap labor. Well, now, Korean workers earn multiple of what the Brazilian workers earn. And they've been able to dramatically transform their economies in ways in which it has not happened in Brazil. So I think that Brazil has to ask itself the question, and it's not just the government, it's also the private sector. Why have we not seen more creative private sector? Why haven't we seen, in spite of the fact that we have elite universities like PUC in Rio or Getulio Vargas or the federal universities of the different states, why we have not seen more dynamism? Why don't we know of Brazilian firms that are globally competitive in areas, outside of Vale or outside of your agricultural powerhouses. No, so that's I think is an important question for Brazilians to ask themselves.
We have been. Rafael,
Sure.
please.
Yeah. Professor, you mentioned the bank, and Brazil has some innovations in financials, such as PIX, for example. But I want to ask you if Brazil can maybe have a path in these areas, and also if you think the AI can help Brazil and other emergent development countries to try to get better in this race for new technologies, or maybe the AI will dip this distance.
Well, that's a great question, and the answer is that we don't know. AI has the possibility of allowing Brazil to leapfrog, because in some sense, AI makes it more accessible to you to use the knowledge that exists in the world. And so, in principle, it should be more powerful in places that have less knowledge, because the shock of having access to more knowledge is bigger in principle. But on the other hand, you have to be able to use those new tools and to have the capacity to leverage them, to use them. And that remains to be seen, to what extent can businesses in Brazil reimagine themselves, reconfigure themselves, so that they can maximize the use of these new technologies. We saw a little bit, for example, I just came back from Indonesia, and people experimented in Indonesia with a concept similar to Uber, but they ended up in a place that's bigger than Uber in some sense, because they realized that this problem of distributing in the last mile was really affecting the whole of the economy. So these delivery services can impact not just people moving around, or not just moving deliveries from restaurants to consumers, but actually much more. And so it has become a much more diversified, bigger as a share of the country's GDP, because they not only adopted technology, they adapted technology. And because they're in a different context, that those adaptations led them to new places. I think that's what needs to happen with these new technologies, and it's an open question to see how effective this is going to be. For example, everybody knows about Amazon. In Latin America, we have Mercado Libre. Mercado Libre is our Amazon. It was kind of came out of Argentina. The company now, for Argentinian reasons, moved their headquarters to Uruguay. But when you get to the Mercado Libre website, there's a Mercado Libre website for each country. Given Latin America's rules, they have not been able to have one Mercado Libre for everybody. And that means that if you're a company, if there was only one Mercado Libre, you list your products in Mercado Libre, and now you can access the whole Latin American market. But that's not the case, because we still have these things chunked by countries. That would be a fantastic kind of agreement for countries to do what it would take to have these platforms that would serve the whole region. That would imply that every company would have access to a bigger market, a market more integrated, more options. It will maybe facilitate entrepreneurship, etc. We still haven't been able to solve it for Mercado Libre. I think that that's just one more example of the things we need to work on to make sure that these technologies really can be leveraged for maximum purpose.
So, a more general question regarding Latin America. I remember that in the developed world, we don't talk much about Latin America in general when we talk about economy and geopolitics. And I wonder, what do you think happened to Latin America in the past 45 years? As you were saying, you talked about two Asian countries and two Latin American countries, and they have completely different outputs. So what happened to us Latin Americans in this past 40, 45 years, last decades, that we don't seem to innovate and to add complexity to our economy in general?
I think that that's a huge puzzle. Why is it that we got stuck in what some people call this middle income trap? Um, uh, but I can tell you the following elements. Um, in many countries in Latin America, we've been able to close education gaps. Brazil is a little bit of a laggard, but I'm sure that if I did the numbers for Sao Paulo would look relatively well. But say, take a country like Chile or Argentina, university enrollment is about 105% of US university enrollment rates. That is, that there's the proportion of people who go to university is larger in these countries than in the US. So we've closed at least this metric of the education gap. But when you look at patenting rates, the US, we are at about 4%, 3% of US patenting rates per capita. So we are still, 96% of the way to go. We are completely laggards in innovation. At a time when Korea is not at 100% US patenting rates, is at 400% US patenting rates, even though they started below us in 1980. So there's something that hasn't happened in Latin America, which is our ability to adopt and adapt technology to a point where we become global leaders in some areas. As I mentioned, in Brazil, you have been able to do it in meat, in soybeans, in minerals, but not in many other areas. So I think that's where we need to work on. We need to think of what it led for Brazil to be able to be a player in the aerospace industry. Why is that the exception more than the rule? That's an important question to ask ourselves. So in general, I would say that Latin America's disappointment was the fact that its firms have not been as innovative as firms in other parts of the world. And I think we should not just ask ourselves, what did the governments do wrong? We should also ask ourselves, what's wrong with our private sector?
Perfect. Rafael?
Professor, my last question, to respecting your time. You also write about how to finance to fight climate change. And Brazil will host the COP30 this year. How do you think Brazil can try to get real results in this area of trying to get more finance and more money to fight climate change?
I would take issue with the question. I would like to first of all reframe the climate change issue in a slightly different way, and then to ask myself the questions about climate finance in a slightly. So first of all, I like to say that the problem is that the world is emitting too many greenhouse gases, and the world has to stop emitting greenhouse gases. And the COP process Rio is part of an annual accord based on the annual meeting based on the Paris Accord, in which every country announces what they are going to do to lower their own emissions. But for the world to lower its emissions, the world is going to need a lot of things. It's going to need to electrify everything that can be electrified. It'll need that electricity in clean ways. It will need to change the way things are manufactured, et cetera, et cetera. For that, the world is going to need a lot of things. It's going to need solar panels, windmills, electrical equipment, electric vehicles, batteries, et cetera, many things. And the question is, who's going to make these things? I like countries to adopt a strategy of what I like to call green growth, which is not to say, let me grow without emitting, etc. It's not about my emissions. It's let me grow by supplying the global needs for decarbonization. So the more the world tries to decarbonize, the more I sell, the more I grow. So that conversation is critical if we want to get buy-in from developing countries. If you want the developing countries to renounce the use of fossil fuels, they're making their future energy sources more complicated. Why would they do that? What's in it for them? They didn't put up the CO2 that's in the air. The climate is impacted not by how much CO2 we emit this year, but by the stock of CO2 that's up there in the air. So I would like to see more of a conversation on how countries can carve a role for themselves, supplying the needs of global decarbonization. I like to say, ask not what you can do to decarbonize your country, ask what your country can do to decarbonize the world. Well, Brazil can offer not only the critical minerals that the world needs to decarbonize, Brazil has an enormous amount of untapped green energy in all of this hydro potential. It already has a lot of hydro green energy and it can do more. So Brazil is particularly well positioned to help the world lower its emissions, not because Brazil is going to lower its emissions, but because Brazil is going to put to global use its green energy resources so that if the world wants to cut its emissions, it's not because you're going to send green energy to Germany. That's an economically nonsensical proposition because green energy is too expensive to move. But German companies, high emitting companies, will have to move to Brazil because in Brazil you can produce things more cheaply in a green way than you can try to do that elsewhere. So that's a conversation of how we're going to replace or redefine the role of Brazil or the role of Latin America or the role of the developing world in a decarbonizing world by having more economic activity, more growth opportunities in our country. So in this case, it would be Brazil attracts energy-intensive industries because it has a comparative advantage in green energy. And that's its growth strategy. I believe some people in Brazil call it power shoring. I like that concept very much. Now, the way the countries in the north are thinking of climate finance is that they want the countries in the south to focus on reducing their own emissions. And to focus on reducing their own emissions by maybe importing the equipment that will allow them to lower their emissions and to decommission their gray electricity generators. And to do that, to create incentives for them to do that, they want to offer climate finance. First comment I would make about climate finance is that countries can always find finance, and they don't find more finance because there's something like a debt limit. There's a certain amount that countries can afford to borrow. And if you offer them climate finance in commercial terms, well, they'll borrow until their debt limit, and that means that they cannot now borrow for education, for health, for infrastructure, for all the other things. So climate finance as commercial term finance is something that countries borrow in substitution of the other things that they would have done with finance. So de facto, they are paying for their own climate transition by foregoing investment in other areas. So I think commercial rate climate finance is no incentive whatsoever to accelerate the path of decommissioning our gray energy resources. We should stop talking about climate finance. We should only talk about climate grants. If you want me to stop doing something, tell me how many grants, how much subsidy you're going to do to give me to to pay for this, because commercial rate finance is something my country can do on its own. I don't need you to do it. So the conversation should be focused exclusively on the grant component of green finance and not on the commercial component of green finance. The commercial component of green finance only makes the numbers look bigger, but the bigger the number, the more the countries are foregoing their investments in other infrastructure, in health and education, whatever other national goals they have.
Professor, we were thinking about ending this interview. I don't know if you, because we want to respect your time, but we don't know if you have anything else you would like to add.
Well, the only thing I would like to add is that really that punches way below its weight as an international power. And part of the reason is that the country expresses a lot of indignation for things that happen in the world proportional to how far they are from them. So the country is very forceful at indignation with things that happen in the Middle East, but is relatively quiet in its neighborhood, in particular in that the country and the country will not be respected in the international arena if it cannot play a constructive role in its own backyard. Even though Brazil is a true democracy at home, its international policy is not a reflection of that democratic commitment.